Iraq is being swept off the earth by the hurricane of wars, and the past decade is not an exception, starting with the US-led invasion in 2003, the Iraq War up to 2011, and the second Iraqi civil war that started in 2014 that goes on these days. Continuous conflicts for decades have a negative impact on every person and every aspect of life within the Iraqi society. The humanitarian crisis in Iraq remains one of the largest and most vital in the world, according to the UN assessment. The surge in violence between armed groups and government and international coalition is resulting in 3 million internally displaced people, according to the UNHCR, and left more than 11 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. Up to these days and during the past decades, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide are not investigated. Perpetrators enjoy impunity, and they fear nothing. These horrendous large-scale mass violations committed by the Iraqi government, security and military forces, government-allied militias, coalition military forces, the US-led coalition, international coalition, the ISIS and other non-state armed groups in Iraq. They are not investigated. Perpetrators are not held accountable, and victims remain without any remedy and reparation. And we have doubts that Iraqi government willing or maybe unable to ensure prompt and independent investigation and protection of civilians. We receive countless testimonies of summer executions, arbitrary detention, rape, torture, ill treatment, and other human rights violations committed by militias and security forces, inadequate, excessive response in so-called liberation operations. That was also the case in Mosul. In July 10th of this year, Iraq Prime Minister announced the liberation of Mosul and victory against the ISIS, which have taken control over Iraq's second largest city in 2014. However, he failed to acknowledge the impact of this liberation army on Mosul inhabitants, infrastructure, and historical sites. More than 40,000 civilians are dead, according to the NGOs on the ground. And since the beginning of the military operation in late 2016, thousands were forcibly displaced. Many were killed, wounded, maimed by violent attacks and airstrikes. Hundreds were used as human shields, and countless men, women, and children tortured, threatened, and arbitrarily killed, and had to leave Mosul. Following months of siege and terror, civilians were forced to leave all that they have and the life they had in Mosul, and to take refuge in makeshift shelters and camps organized poorly by the Iraqi government. In light of this all losses among civilians, today's event aims at shedding light on what's going on in Mosul. We will be also discussing the international community's responsibility to protect civilians and identify viable strategies for reconstruction of the city Mosul and ensure justice and accountability for the victims. And first of all, let me introduce our first speaker, Mr. Doug Adriansens, Executive Committee of Brussels Tribunal. I'll pass the floor to you. Thank you.
Thank you for your presence. I think the Mosul issue and the wider issue of the destruction of the Sunni cities in Iraq is very important to address. I will start maybe with, to sum up a few of the things to give an idea about the scale of the destruction. So the battle for Mosul lasted for 267 days, and it was announced on 10 July as a liberation, but for many, many people inside the city, it was not a liberation. 9 of the 10 major hospitals were destroyed, 76 of the 98 medical centers, 6 bridges across the Tigris, 3/4 of Mosul's roads, 400 educational institutions, including schools, universities, and education centers, 11,000 residential housing units, 4 electrical power plants, and 65% of its electrical network, 6 water purifying systems, and much of the city's water infrastructure has been booby-trapped. The pharmaceutical industrial complex, all grain stores, 2 large dairies, 212 oil refineries, petrol and fuel stations, all public buildings, all states and private banks, 63 religious centers, including churches and mosques, most of them valuable historical sites, 250 workshops, factories and small factories, including agro-industries, 29 hotels, and then more than 40,000 civilian casualties. 38 out of 54 residential areas in West Mosul are destroyed. A staff director in the office of the Nineveh governor said that while eastern Mosul is half destroyed, the devastation in the western half is much greater. And a member of a local volunteer group said that the destruction in the west is close to 99%. Of course, in the rest of Iraq, the humanitarian situation is also disastrous. And if we look at the situation in June 2017, according to OCHA, 11 million people need urgent humanitarian aid, of which 5.1 million children. More than 1 million people have been displaced since the military operations to recapture the city of Mosul since October 2016, with about 3/4 of West Mosul since April. While 1.95 million people have returned to their residences, 3.35 million people remain displaced in Iraq and need humanitarian aid. More than 3 million children attend school only regularly, while 1.2 million children do not go to school at all. Now, the extent of civilian casualties, the massive destruction by American bombs, missiles, and artillery, and the use by the American army of white phosphorus, a weapon that is internationally forbidden for use in populated areas, are all serious US war crimes. The catastrophic number of civilians in Mosul receives little international attention from politicians and journalists. This is in stark contrast to the global outrage on the bombing of eastern Aleppo by the Syrian government and the Russian troops at the end of 2016. It is believed, as I said, that more than 40,000 civilians have been killed as a result of the massive firepower that was used against them, especially by the federal police, air attacks, and ISIS itself. Neither ISIS, nor the international coalition, nor the Iraqi government, nor the United Nations provide accurate information about the number of victims, while groups such as Air Wars largely focus on victims of air attack instead of artillery and rocket attacks. Now, the estimates of Air Wars, who have their information of written sources, what's written in the press, they estimate that 5,805 civilians would have been killed between 19 February and 19 June 2017. But since these numbers only are derived from press reports, they are, as always, only a fraction of the actual number of victims. And Mosul now is also one of the world's largest cemeteries. 2,000 bodies have already been removed from under the rubble, and it is believed that more than 4,000 bodies are still under the rubble in West Mosul. According to the US, the Joint Operational Command, approximately 1,400 bodies were already excavated from under the rubbles. The head of the Civil Defense Unit told the Washington Post that he had asked the government for more equipment and resources, but he had not received any response. Now, the difference between Mosul and the recapture of Ramadi and Fallujah is that in Ramadi and Fallujah, most residents fled or were evacuated before the fighting. However, many Moslawis remained in their homes, making the operation much more complicated. Some stayed because ISIS killed the people who tried to escape. Some remained because they refused to leave their homes or relatives. Some because they had some kind of work. But most of them remained because the government asked them to. The army threw leaflets from helicopters to ask residents not to flee. The reason for this was not only because they feared that the flow of refugees would be unmanageable in a country where already 3.4 million were displaced by the war. This decision was mainly based on the view of the generals who thought to be able to use the citizens in their favor. If the Iraqi forces were to treat the Moslawis well, people would probably help the troops, give information about ISIS, and it would also give good publicity about the salvation efforts of the Iraqi army. On Saturday, 15th of July, Prime Minister al-Abadi organized a victory parade in Baghdad, where Iraqi armed forces marched before his eyes in the protected green zone. It's a sign for the state of the country that the parade was not publicly announced due to security issues, that the media only came to know later, and that the people of the city were excluded from the festivities. But there was no reason to celebrate because of also the enormous losses suffered by Iraqi forces. For instance, the counter-terrorism service, an American-trained unit, they lost 40% of its people in the struggle for Mosul. And how do we know? Because that figure was reported in the US Department of Defense, which called for $1.269 billion to rebuild the unit over the next 3 years and train 20,000 staff members. And the budget proposal said the requested funding will be essential for the reconstruction of the CTS combat force that has lost 40% in Mosul. So another indication for the losses of armed forces are that Middle East Monitor reported on February 23 that 7,000 Iraqi soldiers and military members had already been killed. While the number of civilians is always being downplayed by the media and politicians, Iraq keeps increasing the number of victims of ISIS warriors. So on July 16, General Abdul Amir Yarallah of the Nineveh Operation Command announced that more than 25,000 rebels were killed during the Mosul campaign. On July 19, that number had already risen to 30,000. And to emphasize how the Iraqi government increases its number, in January, the Iraqi Ministry of Defense declared that there were only 9,400 ISIS elements in Mosul. And the Americans, they are even worse. General Sean McFarland, commander of the US coalition, estimated that in August 2016, only 15,000 to 20,000 ISIS fighters remained in Iraq and Syria. But on a discussion at the Aspen Security Forum on Friday, July 21, General Raymond Thomas, head of the US Special Operation Command, claimed that the US-led offensive had killed 60,000 to 70,000 ISIS militants. So we suspect that many of these killed ISIS militants would have been civilians. Now, on Friday, July 14, according to the International Organization for Migration, 825,000 Moslawis were still displaced by the offensive. Men, women and children who escaped the destruction of Mosul are housed in tents, camps, often in virtual prisons. Return is impossible for the majority of these internally displaced war refugees. Many do not have homes to return to because of the artillery and air attacks, and most of the city has no access to water and electricity. Food is scarce, and schools and hospitals are destroyed. The Ministry of Migration tries to encourage the displaced persons to return to their homes. And they organize seminars in the refugee camps to encourage people to return. The UN interviewed displaced after such a presentation. Some said that they had nothing to return to because their homes were destroyed. They had no money left, and they didn't feel the need to return until the services were restored and the economy was relaunched. Another problem that the United Nations noted was that the Migration Department has no programs for people who return. The ministry also does not provide the monthly payments on which the displaced persons are entitled. Then another problem is that 10% of the explosives that have been used by the US coalition have not exploded, causing thousands of bombs and grenades to explode in the future, on top of the abandoned booby traps left by ISIS. And experts have warned that it may take a decade to clear all explosives in the city. Then, of course, there is also the corruption. There's a high level of corruption among the Iraqi soldiers occupying Mosul. They undermine the security measures to neutralize ISIS in the wake of their defeat. Suspected ISIS member, they can proceed through military checkpoints after payment of $1,000, and they can bring a vehicle after payment of $1,500. So Mosul residents are skeptical of what they can expect from government forces. Corruption by the occupying military forces take also other forms, like Moslawis pay soldiers $100 for removing a body from the rubble, and others pay $500 to return to their homes, if it's still habitable. But then Iraqi military and military units have always been accused of asking money for citizens' protection. Also, they demand money from truckers who bring goods to the civilian population, and so they are a particularly profitable milk cow if they go through military checkpoints. Destruction is nothing new for Iraq, and neither is the mismanagement of rebuilding. This problem was already on prominent display in a 2013 report by the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction, which found that the 60 billion in US funds spent over 10 years in the country produced few tangible results. The report blamed this on poor coordination with Iraqis, misplaced priorities, misplanned projects, contractor wastefulness, corruption, and security problems. Iraq's government, which spent $138 billion during this period, did not do any better. Former Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki has lost $500 billion during his terms in office, according to the Iraqi Commission of Integrity. The Commission of Integrity is responsible for investigating corruption scandals in Iraq. And he said, the spokesperson said, nearly half of government revenues during the 8-year period was stolen. And he called it the biggest political corruption scandal in history. Iraq's oil revenues amounted to $800 billion between 2006 and 2014, and the Maliki government also received $250 billion of dollars from various countries, including the US. This is a bad sign for the eventual reconstruction of the destroyed cities in the Sunni areas, namely Ramadi, Fallujah, Mosul, and Al-Qaim, and others. Why do I tell you this about the corruption? I think it is very important to know that not only sectarianism is a factor in the destabilization of the Iraqi country, but also bad governance. Remarkable is the Mercy Corps 2-year investigation investing in Iraq's peace, published in January 2016. And the main finding from their investigation is that sectarianism is not the main cause of the current unrest. When the Islamic State quickly conquered a large part of the Sunni part of Iraq in 2014, experts describe this as a natural consequence of the sectarian heritage of the country and a consequence of the Sykes-Picot Accords. But from Mercy Corps' research between 2013 and 2015, it appears that the main factor for the rise of ISIS is not the sectarian division, but rather, as they call it, an absence of inclusive, responsive, and responsible governance. We must remember that this government has been supported by the United States and also by Iran. They have all observers in the ministries. Now, why did Mercy Corps come to this conclusion? The news about the resignation of Prime Minister Maliki in August 2014 was considered by the Sunni as good news. And just the announcement that Maliki would be replaced made the support for armed groups such as ISIS drop from 49% to 26%. Although Prime Minister Maliki's successor Haider al-Abadi is also a Shia, Sunnis expected an improvement in public services, and their perception about government agencies changed. In other words, sectarianism did not appear to be the primary or only cause of stability. Proper administration would greatly reduce support for further sectarian polarization. But the expectations of better governance have not been met. Little progress has been made in the promised reforms. As a result, public opinion polls show that trust in the central government continues to erode. From July 2015, public frustration caused major violent demonstrations across the country against corruption, poor services and sectarianism. These protests are still continuing. Nevertheless, the non-violent movement threatens to be overshadowed by the growing success of armed groups, including the increasingly powerful Shia militias. Prime Minister al-Abadi seems to have little control over these militias, and this poses a major threat to the future of Iraq and the reconstruction of its cities. If good government is not, the criteria for good governments are not being met, sectarianism could be the most important factor of instability in the near future. And the study, as I said, shows that improving government performance is essential for a just and peaceful Iraq. But that means that corruption has to stop, that the government infighting among Shia groups, among Sunni groups, that the infighting has to stop, and that they have to come up with a clear program for the future of the country. But also, unfortunately, donor investment in Iraqi civil society is deteriorating. In 2011, the US government's annual spending on one soldier in Iraq was an average of $802,000, or $80 billion a year for a minimum of 10,000 troops. What the US government has invested in democracy and civilian programs in 2016 is nothing compared to military spending. $72.5 million. There is no miraculous solution for building stability in Iraq, but good governance is essential for addressing the causes of instability. The report also provides insights and recommendations on how Iraqi and large donors can wisely and effectively contribute to pave the way for a fair and peaceful future in Iraq. And I will conclude. Instead of calling the ISIS fighters and their supporters sad, murderous losers, first of all, we must try to understand the complex social, economic, and political factors that made ISIS a success story. In addition, Iraqi civilian peace initiatives should actively be supported and published by the media, which they don't. With a fraction of the astronomical sum spent on the war, valuable projects that exceed the sectarian contradictions should be promoted. And the problem is also this: we must urgently come to terms with our own devastating role in the Middle East and North Africa. Military interventions from the West in the Middle East, North Africa region have played a decisive role in the radicalization of Muslims in the West. The West has supported the Iraqi government when they shot unarmed Sunni demonstrators, bombing Sunni territories, and supported Shia militias that committed large-scale war crimes, putting all the emphasis on ISIS as also an important political role. The denial of the Western's own destructive war campaign, which has destroyed the region, has hurt the population greatly, and caused the refugee crisis. And with this, I stop my talk.
Thank you very much, Dirk.
Yeah.
It was very informative. I've learned a lot myself today as well. But I like ICRC motto saying that even wars have limits. So I think it's noteworthy to remind that all parties to the conflict are obliged to comply with the provisions of international humanitarian law. excessive use of force, disproportionate military response, and definitely prohibition of targeting civilian objects is just to name the few of those that all parties should be complying with. And speaking of the right to return, it's also an international obligation of the Iraqi government, first of all, to ensure that all who fled Mosul have a right to return and to favorable conditions where they have protection of the government. Now I would love to pass the floor to another colleague we have here, Dr. al-Abadi. He's a researcher in the Middle Eastern political history and Islamic studies, and will try to give us a little bit hope and speak about possible ways forward, what to do next, and reconstruction of Mosul. And please pay attention to the screen.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presence, and I appreciate this opportunity to present the vision of Mosul Foundation, which is a non-governmental organization, non-profitable organization, as it is stated out on the screen. I am very happy to be in this place to bring to you an accurate picture of what has been and what's still happening in Mosul. Civic society needs to be able to bring its difficulties and problems directly to an international audience when it is no longer possible to communicate and reach government. Let alone when the government is itself the main problem or the main cause of these difficulties. At the same time, the United Nations needs to hear the facts directly from civic society institutions if it is going to be successful in its difficult task of restoring local and regional peace and security, leading ultimately to the global stability that we all seek. The population of Mosul cannot find peace and security with any of the institutions of the Iraqi state. And with their city lying in ruins, they cannot find a place to shelter. Security has been a serious issue in Mosul since 2003. First, because of the sectarian policies of the Iraqi security forces that humiliated the population and refused to listen to their peaceful demands and enacted a policy of detention without trial. Second, during the ISIS occupation, following the utter failure of the Iraqi government to defend the city. And finally, during the battle to retake the city, a battle in which the Iraqi government ignored all the advice and warnings of military experts and encircled ISIS inside the old city, used excessive force and random dump weapons to kill more than 40,000 innocent civilians. Iraqi government forces have been implicated by the United Nations and a multitude of human rights organizations in this crime that has resulted in the destruction of the city. The catastrophic price for the battle in terms of lives and the destruction of the city infrastructure can be appreciated when compared with the retaking of the neighboring city, Tal Afar, in which ISIS were allowed to withdraw, and the town was peacefully retaken, sparing the city and its population. Having said that, Mosul is not going back to square one. The political result of this battle is that the city is once more in the hands of sectarian militias that have now been incorporated within the apparatuses of the state, levying taxes and conducting acts of kidnapping, extrajudicial executions, and the confiscation or destruction of private property while wearing police and army uniforms. Government-sponsored militias are actively changing the political map of the city to influence the results of any future elections, a behavior not befitting a member state of the United Nations, and is more reminiscent of total chaos that follows the failure and collapse of the state, as was the case in Bosnia and Kosovo, for example. Today, the sons of Mosul must prove their innocence from the accusations that they cooperated with ISIS that can be made by any militiaman, resulting in a swift death in front of the iPhone cameras. These are, of course, some of the images perhaps you've already seen about Mosul. This is Western Mosul, the historic sector of Mosul, which has been absolutely destroyed. These are all houses of families consisting of at least 5, 7, sometimes 10 individuals. Total destruction. I am from Mosul. I can't tell where this street is. It's beyond recognition. The destruction of Mosul has been estimated at anything between 70% and 100%. The coffers are empty, and the government is corrupt. No money from inside, no money coming from outside, as the government is not trusted by international donors. Who will rebuild Mosul, and with what funds? The answers are becoming clearer to the people of Mosul. Mosul will never be rebuilt. The results would be catastrophic for the city of Mosul and its population. These include the ethnic cleansing on sectarian lines to change the demographics of the population, the destruction of the culture of religious and ethnic tolerance, for which the city is renowned and which the region is in much need for, the removal of a major center of civilizations in the region that has long acted as an intellectual safety valve, the creation of a drug economy based on the influence of powerful warlords, the rise of a vice-based economy, mysterious monies made available, and this is happening already, to buy land and real estate in Mosul at tempting prices, the transformation of the character of the city's population from that of an ancient center of civilization to one of refugee camp dwellers, and the creation of a new generation of millions of uneducated, helpless young people and extremists. The destruction of the cultural, artistic, intellectual, and artisans' folk heritage of Mosul society. These changes will not be reversible with time. This chronic political failure and the record levels of corruption in Iraq have transformed the institutions of the state, constitution, parliament, the judiciary, and the security forces, have transformed them all into an ethnic sectarian battleground. This has crippled the instruments of the state and made it impossible for the government to be held accountable in the normal way. The situation is made worse by the inability or unwillingness of the Iraqi government to follow the norms that govern the relationship between government and its population, as defined by the United Nations. The situation also makes it makes it near impossible for Mosul civic society to make any form of meaningful contribution towards finding a solution based on the experience of other nations. The destroyed city of Mosul, named Hiroshima's twin, is facing a stark conundrum. No redevelopment without scrupulous, competent administration. No honest administration without security, and no security without the removal of the state-sponsored militias from the city. The cost of this conundrum is colossal. Security is the key to the rehabilitation of Mosul. The population of the city cannot find peace and security with any of the institutions of the Iraqi state. And the only remaining viable option left in the face of the annihilation of the city is to seek international protection for the city. In the light of these considerations, Mosul society, represented by its professional sons and daughters, calls the United Nations to declare Mosul a disaster city and provide protection for its citizens to fill the following vital duties. Number one, provide security and international supervision on the removal of militias from the city. Two, oversee the removal of corrupt government-appointed officials from city offices and institutions. Three, enable civic society to form a temporary or political administration to run the city and prepare for future elections to determine the nature of the city governing administration. Four, oversee the allocation of part of the national oil revenues as an oil for redevelopment and compensation program to be deposited in a special fund together with any international donations. And five, international supervision of the funding and execution of all redevelopment projects. This catastrophic state of affairs was predicted by the Mosul Foundation before the battle to retake Mosul. The Foundation warned of the results of this battle and put forward a realistic roadmap to deal with this situation. Today, and after what we had predicted sadly became a reality, we are advocating for this roadmap with the support of tens of thousands of the sons and daughters of Mosul from all walks of life and from all professionals and specializations. The Mosul Foundation hopes that you and the United Nations Agency will respond positively to this legitimate and just request. And thank you very much for your generous attention.
Thank you. That was quite an emotional presentation. Having served myself in United Nations humanitarian response team, I know it's a tough job to do, to protect civilians and ensure rehabilitation. And you mentioned Kosovo. I've been a part in the team of rehabilitating Kosovo and the international response to the crisis there. A lot of money coming in and it's important how it is spent. If you look at the humanitarian response plans on Iraq particularly, the funds are not enough to cover even the needs identified by UN agencies. And when you look at different armed conflicts and civilians in armed conflicts, you're wondering, on one side you have international coalition interfering and giving military response to protect civilians. And then on the other side, you see that those governments, be it US, be it Russia, name any other, giving not enough money to reconstruct. I understand collateral damage. I understand technology in this age is not that precise to avoid bombarding civilians and huge civilian objects like hospitals. But then you made a mess. Let's try to build it up together and fix it now. So observing the situation, and particularly Mosul, is extremely disappointing and upsetting, and reminds us about human nature again and again. But we are happy to have people like you on the ground who are trying to do their best and fighting for their own people and ensure that they have brighter future than the previous generation and the current generation. Now we have a very interesting speaker. Unfortunately, our speaker Ahmed couldn't make it today, so I would like to give the floor to a testimony, to a person who came from Iraq himself and saw what's going on there, and he would like to pass the message from the IDPs themselves. And I would like to invite our person, mysterious person, but as a prize, not in the agenda, Dr. Al-Janabi. Please, floor is yours. We would like to hear what's going on the ground. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you very much, Madam. Distinguished representatives, I'm a doctor. I'm also a university professor, and I am the head of Masar Organization for Human Development, one of the NGOs working within Iraq. I am a resident of an area called Jarf al-Sakhr. Maybe you haven't heard of it, or some of you might know it. Jarf al-Sakhr is situated at the south of Baghdad. It extends over an area of 1,625 square kilometers, and the inhabitants reach 120,000 people. All the inhabitants of these areas have become IDPs. In other words, there are no citizens available. 3 years ago, all these people had to leave the country by force, and as a result of the inability of the successive governments to restore the rule of law and to provide security, as well as the foreign intervention, as you had said earlier, and as we have heard by many speakers, these conditions led to the spread and entrenchment of Daesh within these areas, which was in majority Sunni. And this was exploited, the vacuum of security. In 2012, Daesh controlled Jarf al-Sakhr, and they spread after the withdrawal of all the Iraqi security forces who were entrusted with the protection of this area. And this led, of course, to the advent of Daesh in huge numbers. After this phase, and after the arrival of Daesh, the government started intense bombardment with explosive barrels in the area, which led to the expulsion of the inhabitants of the area and the destruction of 2,500 housing units. And In October 2014, that is after the advent of Daesh inside Mosul by 3 months, these Daesh forces from Jarf al-Sakhr, we were able to expel them, and so the militias managed to expel Daesh as well as whoever remained in that area, all the other original inhabitants. Since October 2014 until now, the area is now completely vacated of its original inhabitants. And the controlling militia now is Hezbollah. Hezbollah has turned this area into a closed area where they have their headquarters, their weapon factories, and where they have secret prisons. Until now, the IDPs are forbidden from going home. The Prime Minister, his cabinet, and the Babel Government Council wanted to help and wanted to return the IDPs. However, they were unable to facilitate the return of the IDPs because the decision is not in their hands. The religious leaders themselves were unable to facilitate the return, nor the mediation by the heads of tribes. So every attempt to return the IDPs failed. Iran sent an official invitation to a formal delegation to go to Iran and negotiate the return of IDPs. Iran accepted the return of IDPs. And this is quite ironic that Iran controls even the return of 120,000 to a small area inside Iraq. So you can imagine how much is the control of Iran over Iraq if it refuses to relinquish control over a small area. This meeting with Iran happened about a year and a half ago, and Iran accepted. However, procrastination began, and the approval was more of a trick, and it was every time we noticed that there was pressure to allow for the IDPs' return, the more the intransigence was felt by all other forces. And finally, now there is a decision taken by Hezbollah that anyone who calls and tries to facilitate the return of IDPs will be criminalized according to their own laws. Of course, this is something horrible, and this shows how much these laws violate international instruments. And I hope you will see the importance of this. There is mistakes that were committed by the American administration. There is an inability by the Iraqi government. There is an increased strength by the militias and their control over the area and the country. The civil society organization, the religious leaders and tribes are unable to influence the militias, particularly Hezbollah militias. In conclusion, I should like to remind you of your human responsibility and call upon all peace-loving countries to bring pressure to bear, to do their utmost in order to provide assistance to and facilitate the dignified return of all IDPs to their areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very important to get information from the first hands and the witnesses by themselves sharing their stories with us and what's going on the ground. Before we pass to the questions part of the side event, I would like to remind you that the full report of this event will be published very soon on the webpage of the Geneva International Center for Justice. And referring to Iran, we have also a publication that will be distributed now on human rights violations in Iran. Now we have the time for questions. If you could address the speakers. Questions first. The lady, please. Introduce yourself and just speak up.
Merci, madame. Je vais parler en français et je serai assistée.
Non, la modérateur vous aidera. C'est elle qui traduit.
Ok, d'accord. Merci. Je suis Adja Zenaba Katara. Je suis la vice-présidente nationale de la Croix-Rouge centrafricaine. Je remercie infiniment tous les panélistes qui ont pu préparer ce travail énorme pour porter à notre connaissance aujourd'hui. Et j'apprécie également la clarté de votre présentation. Dommage, je ne pourrais pas m'exprimer correctement en anglais. Je suis obligée de prendre la parole en français. Rien qu'à voir et écouter vos différentes présentations, je peux dire que c'est un événement apparenté à tout ce qui s'est déroulé en République centrafricaine. Nous avons vécu les mêmes choses, comme Mosul a vécu. Et je me réjouis d'être parmi les frères ici, étant donné que nous allons échanger les expériences pour voir comment les autres ont fait après la crise. Sur la page que j'avais reçue, je vois qu'il y a des femmes qui portent les enfants entre les mains. Et c'est ce qui se passe partout dans le monde. Souvent, quand il y a la crise qui éclate, les femmes et les enfants deviennent plus vulnérables. Et c'est souvent une situation catastrophique. Et c'est des événements qui frappent à l'œil. C'est des choses très, très horribles. On ne souhaite pas la guerre, mais la guerre arrive. Ce qu'on déplore aussi, c'est l'impact de cette guerre sur l'avenir des enfants et du coup l'avenir du pays. Alors, sans pour autant monopoliser la parole, je voudrais demander à mes frères ici de me dire et de nous dire par contre quel était le sort de ces femmes et de ces enfants pendant la crise, automatiquement après la crise et aujourd'hui. Deuxième question. Quel était le rôle que la Fondation Mosul a joué et également des actions que la Fondation Mosul a posées pour la prise en charge des femmes et de ces enfants. Parce que c'est leur vie qui était en danger. Et la dernière question, étant donné que je suis de la Croix-Rouge, certainement que mes frères et sœurs du Croissant Rouge irakien ont certainement dû faire quelque chose pendant cette crise. Alors, est-ce que nous pouvons savoir qu'est-ce que le Croissant Rouge irakien avait fait pour assister les vulnérables pendant cette crise et surtout prévenir les conflits dans l'avenir? Je vous remercie.
Madame, malheureusement, Madame,
Oui.
malheureusement, il n'y a pas de traduction, je pense que de français. Je vais essayer de traduire en anglais, peut-être poser des questions à mes
Merci.
collègues.
Merci.
Just to quickly make a short translation of what was been said in French. The lady is from the Red Cross from CAR, African Republic, and she was very much referring to the sufferings of women and children in war, particularly. And she was referring to our speakers in general, to people very much concerned about the situation in Iraq, on possible ways of exchanging experience. And there was a particular question to our colleague here from Mosul Foundation. She was referring what was the role and actions proposed by your foundation when it comes to women and children. And another general question was how to, the situation of women and children in any armed conflict are the most vulnerable group. How to address their grievances. And she was referring to the pictures we have on our flyer, that it's mainly the women carrying the kids out when the war starts. Men are busy with other things most of the time, but of course I don't want to be discriminatory towards men. But unfortunately, women and children are the most suffering. So the question to you is, what was your role during the attacks in Mosul, and what are your actions to be taken when it comes to women and children? And if you have any contacts to Red Cross in Iraq, if there is a way to exchange and experiences with Red Cross in African Republic.
Thank you very much for the question. Mosul Foundation was established just before the war. It was established in April this year. The main role of the organization is to respond to a vacuum, to a role which hasn't been taken up by anybody, which is to make Mosul a safe place for the civic society to take its role. This is the main role of Mosul Foundation. Mosul Foundation is mainly consists of Iraqis, of Moslawis, sons of daughters of Mosul who live abroad. There are some who are still in Mosul, but the actual administration of the foundation is abroad. Is to reach out to the world and explain to the world that there is no solution for Mosul from within, for the reason I laid out in my speech. The government is the cause of the problem. ISIS was made by the government, or allowed to take Mosul, to occupy Mosul. So the corruption is so deep that nothing cannot be achieved on the ground. Women, children have suffered and continue to do so. Money donated are going missing as well. So there's no hope from inside, and the solution has to come from outside. Mosul Foundation campaigns and take advantage of a platform like this to make the voice of the people of Mosul heard by international organization, to provide protection for the city, to declare it as disaster area, and to allow the civic societies in Mosul to take up the role which the politicians have failed to do so. This is the vision of Mosul Foundation, and the people of Mosul are responding to this vision positively and increasingly after the destruction of their city, and after seeing by their own eyes that there is no hope as long as the city is in the hands of the government. The government has to come out of the city, and the civic society has to take the role and pave the role. Most of the city of Mosul is rich of scientists, of experts. Hardly walk into a hospital or an institute in the West without finding an expert from Mosul. Mosul University provided the West, with doctors, engineers, all sorts of all walks of scientific specialization. It's not short of those. The only thing Mosul is short of is security. Security has to be provided and can only be provided by international supervision, and the government then forced by international law to evacuate the city and give the administration to the civic society of the city.
Thank you very much. It's all in our hands, isn't it? As long as there are many hands to help out.
It is.
Well, when you look at this destruction, you really want to be in French they would say bon courage. Let's work harder. Let's take a number of questions. I see many hands. Let's start from the first row of questions. Two gentlemen over there, please.
طارق شندي من المركز الدولي للدراسات السياسية.
طارق شندي from the Center for Political Studies. We have listened to the interventions of different panelists, and we have listened to the testimony of one of the inhabitants of this destroyed city, Jarf al-Sakhar. Before the city fell to Daesh, we have seen a withdrawal of the Iraqi security forces. Afterwards, ISIS withdrew, and we have now militias, and we are witnessing the whole destruction of this city. This scenario was the same in Syria, for example. And I have the question, why are witnessing the same thing? Nobody from Daesh was arrested. Nobody or nobodies were found from the fighters of Daesh. I would like to comment on something. One of my Yemeni friends, who is an activist in human rights, Houthis have made atrocities, but this is greater than what Daesh have done to the Iraqi population. But unfortunately, Daesh concluded an agreement with Hezbollah, and the Syrian regime was protected and is enjoying the international protection, and now they went to Raqqa, and the international media said the mission is done. Mr. Hafiz wanted the international community to intervene, and the international community does know that Daesh is a fabrication. It is the direct consequence of Nour al-Maliki and the Syrian regime. Unfortunately, this regime is destroying the country with the help of Shia militias. The international community doesn't want to bomb Daesh. These are questions that we have to raise before everybody. Why Daesh is everywhere in Iraq and in Syria without any intervention from the international coalition or the international community? There is an alliance between Daesh and the Iraqi government, and I would like to summarize the situation. Daesh is Hezbollah and the terrorist militias. They are all the same, and they are made in Iran. Daesh, Hezbollah, and Shia militias are all the same. As I said, the only difference between all these factions is that Daesh, when they kill and massacre, they propagate their atrocities via social media. As for militia groups, they hide their crimes so that Daesh can be the true terrorists, and they undermine the Sunni Islam, and they undermine the image of Arab societies. They give the West justifications, and they want to tell the West, we are the terrorists, and the alliance with Shia militias, we can destroy these terrorists. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I heard the speakers which they have introduced their view, which excellent and informative. Struck me when you mentioned that for the coalitions, which they had military coalitions, but they don't have economic coalitions. That's expected. All of us, we know that Iraq has a lot of resources. They don't know, that doesn't need, even if there is good administration, they don't need even support from the UN or international community. We have not heard any commitment from the UN or international community that rebuilding Mosul. Of course, as we know that UN has to play a role. We did not hear in Geneva, we did not hear at the time when High Commissioner has presented his report to the Council, we did not hear about this destruction. We did not hear about the suffering of the civilians in Mosul. We did not hear much commitment, even in the United Nations or with UN agencies. Now, this is, as Dr. Al-Hafiz, he was mentioning the security dimension, which it is required for them. Of course, we know security dimension, it's important, but, well, we know Iraq has full of resources, but we need to see the future challenges. Now, I have a specific question to Dr. Al-Hafiz, or maybe to our speaker, or here from right, our right. Now, I would like you to clarify more about sectarian and ethnic balances and implications before the conflict, before the occupations, and after the occupations, and what is the role of regional powers, especially Turkey and Iran? Thank you very much.
مرحبا، هدى صلاح الدين من مؤسسة الميزان لحقوق الإنسان من فلسطين.
My name is Huda Salahuddin from Mizan in Palestine. We Palestinians are particularly sensitive when we see the situation of Arab countries, particularly after the Arab Spring, because in 1948 we lived the Nakba, we lived the displacement, we lived disenfranchisement and dispossession. Therefore, we can empathize, we feel what is happening, and we are not objective when we look at these photos. We understand the pain of the Iraqi, Syrian, and Yemeni peoples. Mr. Hafiz, you said that what is taking place in Mosul and in Iraq in general is the failure by the politicians, by the international community. But I feel if they really wanted to move and to react, they would have done that from the first year these events began to happen. And this is not the first time that I attend an international forum like this one. A year ago, I was at the European Commission, and I worked there for 3 months in the Commission for Human Rights and Foreign Relations Committee. And every time there is an event or a lecture or a seminar on Syria, on Palestine, every session was concluded with that we call upon this, we want, but it fizzles down to zero, to nothing. It remains statements up in the air. It remains a whitewash of all what's happening. And I believe when we limit the calls on Arab countries, we never see any Syrian action. So why do you think that Arab populations are stagnant? They don't react?
From the lady, just to keep the gender equality, and I'm afraid we have just 10 minutes for our dear speaker and our gentleman behind there to reply. Please go ahead.
شكرا. حقيقة أولا أعرف عن نفسي.
Thank you. I am Huda al-Sarari, a lawyer from Yemen. I agree with what I have seen regarding the destruction and terrorism in Mosul. And this reminds me of what my country, and particularly Aden, is going through when the Houthi militias took over my city. And the civil organizations and the activists were able to provide services. We also helped in humanitarian rescue and search. And we also faced Al-Qaeda, and as a civil security, as a civil organization, we stepped up our work. But I disagree with you regarding security. Security can only be begotten through the security forces and the state of law. I don't believe that any international organization or the international community can bring security to a country. We also need the assistance by humanitarian organizations to remove the corpses. We were not given any assistance. We had, as civil organization and activists, to remove bodies and to clean because we suffered cholera spread and other diseases. Hence, my reiteration that the work has to come from the local communities. Thank you.
With the permission of the gentleman, can I just go straight to the answer of the lady here and then come back to your question, if you may? The lady touched upon a very important point, which I think it's in the minds of everyone here, as why the international community is not responding to our calls. And this is a fact. This is a very stark fact. But I disagree with the comments the chairman used. Is this wasn't an emotional speech. It was a strategic speech in my vision. Now that problems is the center of the whole issue, as why the international community is not responding. It will never respond. This is not contradiction. It will respond because there are no favors in international politics. There are no favors. The international community will respond when there is a common ground and common interest between our societies and the societies of the West. Corruption in politics, not only in our countries. Western politicians are corrupt as well. There's only one question in the West which can find an answer. Politicians can, in the West, can provide answer for every single case except for one. What's happening in the Middle East? There's no answer for that. And the citizens in the West are puzzled. On the one hand, they find scientists, nuclear scientists, doctors, engineers, you call them, you name them, in every institute, in every corner in the West. On the other hand, they're being told by the media that the people of the Middle East are mad. They cannot live democratic life. They don't have systems. They can't just run their own affairs. This is the only question the citizens in the West cannot understand. And, well, they don't bother about it. But they only bother when problems are hitting their capitals and city. This is the new thing. Now we, as civic societies in the East, in the Middle East or in the Arabic countries, have a common interest now with the civic society in the West, because the politicians in the West are failing to address this issue badly. And bombs are going off in London, Madrid, Paris, and it's coming from there. So long as those societies are not rectified and fixed, problems going to continue in the West. Now we can fix our societies and then we'll both benefit. So this is a new thing. This is a new approach which the politicians, neither in our societies nor in the West, are interested in. The only body who is interested in are civic societies and NGOs in our society and in the West. So we both have a common project. And this is why we're here. And this is why we are keen in Mosul Foundation and in other NGOs of similar nature, keen to talk to NGOs in the West. Because NGOs in the West is a third sector, is a mature sector. It's even more mature than the government themselves. Elections in the West now, participants in the elections are diminishing in the West. Sometimes they hardly hit 35, 40%. Why? Is it because people are careless? No. But they are having less confidence in the political system and they are moving to NGOs. So NGOs is gaining ground at the expense of political establishment. This is our project. And when this project is the joint project of all societies in the East and the West is mature, we will find results. Because the political establishment in the West needs the NGO. The NGO can let the political establishment down. So this is our powerful tool. And we have to take advantage of and to take advantage of such platforms to make our voice heard. And we will find results. And we are already finding results. And of course, it will snowball. I will address, I will come back to the gentleman there. The regional powers in around Iraq do have influence on what's going on in Iraq. And again, these countries, the tools of these countries are the politicians inside Iraq, the corrupt politicians. Each one of them is controlled by these powers, either by money or media or by some other relation. The only people who don't actually worry about the regional interests are the people themselves, the civic societies themselves. They are not influenced by money, media, or any affiliation. They are only influenced by their interest. So if the civic society is handed the responsibility of the city, these influences will diminish. What was the third question?
Daesh intervention. Daesh, where is it coming from?
Daesh. Yeah. Well, Daesh is a result of a late result of a very old cause. Daesh is a natural result of a fact. When the religious establishments in the East were demolished or nationalized by governments, kids took over. I mean, those people who, Osama bin Laden and others, when they joined this course, they were kids. They were teenagers. But later on, of course, but this is how they started. There's a vacuum. The religious institutions in the East have been nationalized and given to some corrupt people, and giving the chance and opportunity for kids to take up this role and fill the vacuum and cause this very major problem to the societies. Of course, countries like Iran managed to take advantage of this to the maximum, and any other intelligence establishments also took advantage of this phenomena, and the result is what we are seeing now. Once these institutions are fixed, once the society is back to the right hands, all these problems, symptoms will disappear. They can quickly be fixed once the civic society take over.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to listen to you. And I will just pass a few minutes to Dr. Al-Janabi, please. please. There was a question towards you, if you would like to reply. Yes, no?
شكرا.
Thank you, ma'am. May I comment on the subject of Daesh? As the distinguished panelist said, our common responsibility is to overcome this phenomenon between the civil society, between the government, and the international community. All three structures have to cooperate together to overcome the current situation. We have to get rid of economic and political corruption. We have to strengthen civic society, and the religious establishment is ineffective. We hardly hear their voice. I believe this, in a nutshell, are the factors that can influence. What you have said about the situation of women and children, we know, and you know, that they're the first victim in any war, and they're the ones who suffer most. I wanted to give an example, the education, for example. The government paid attention in order to contain the highest number of the IDPs in the education sector, but it failed. Though now it's the privileged who can have education. In the past, we were declared as a country that was free of illiteracy by UNESCO also. And however, we have regressed, and now illiteracy is 40% of the population. The student goes to school for 3 days, and the other 3 days or 4 days they cannot go to school is because there are not enough number of schools. And in the 3 days, they study for 3 hours. So even those who do have the chance to attend school are getting 40% of the education they deserve. Thank you.
We have to conclude the meeting because the next meeting shall take place. I appreciate your participation, and if you'd like to ask questions from the speakers, please go ahead in person. Thank you.